A man walks into Rikers Island with nothing but the clothes on his back and a court date 3 weeks away. He hasn't been convicted of anything. He is legally innocent. But within 48 hours, he will be asked to choose a side in a war he didn't start. And his answer will determine whether he sleeps, eats, or survives at all. This is not an isolated story. According to the New York City Board of Correction, Rikers Island houses an average of 5,000 to 6,000 detainees on any given day, the majority of them pretrial, not sentenced, waiting. And inside those walls, a parallel system of power runs alongside the official one. Gang affiliations, territorial housing units, debts, and grudges follow people in from the streets of the Bronx, Brooklyn, and Harlem. And in Rikers, those street conflicts don't pause. They escalate. What you're about to see is not about glorifying that world. It's about understanding how human beings, many of them young, many of them scared, develop strategies to survive a system that, by every documented account, has failed them. This is how prisoners cope with gang conflicts at Rikers Island. If you've ever wondered how a place this broken keeps producing the same cycles, stay with us. Because what happens inside these walls has everything to do with what happens on your streets. Subscribe if you're new, and don't move. This gets far more complicated. Rikers Island is not one jail. It is 10 separate facilities packed onto a 413-acre island in the East River between Queens and the Bronx. It is one of the largest jail complexes in the world, and for most of its modern history, one of the most violent. To understand how gang conflict works inside Rikers, you first have to understand what Rikers actually is. Most people imagine prison as a place where sentences are served. But roughly 80% of people at Rikers on any given day are pretrial detainees. They haven't been convicted. They are there because they couldn't afford bail. And they are housed, sometimes for months, sometimes for years, in facilities that the Department of Justice, Human Rights Watch, and multiple independent investigations have described as chronically understaffed, dangerously overcrowded, and structurally incapable of controlling violence. The DOJ investigation launched in 2021 found that the New York City jail system, centered at Rikers, had failed to provide reasonable safety for people in its custody. Serious injuries among incarcerated people had risen sharply. Stabbings, slashings, and assaults were documented in official reports at rates that alarmed federal investigators. But statistics don't tell you what it actually feels like to be dropped into that environment at 19 years old with a robbery charge and no money for bail. Former detainees who have spoken to journalists, researchers, and advocacy organizations describe the same pattern on arrival. The first question isn't from a counselor. It isn't from a case manager. It comes from another incarcerated person, sometimes within hours. Where are you from? What block? What set? The question sounds casual. It is not casual. It is an assessment. It is the beginning of a classification process that happens entirely outside official channels. A shadow intake system run by the people who have already survived long enough to know how things work. According to researchers who have studied Rikers for the Vera Institute of Justice, gang-affiliated housing, the informal clustering of people by street affiliation, has been a structural reality at Rikers for decades. Despite official policies against it, housing units frequently become dominated by specific crews: Bloods, Crips, Latin Kings, Trinitarios, various Bronx and Brooklyn Street sets. The reasons are partly administrative. Shared affiliations reduce conflict in the short term when officers are already overwhelmed. But the long-term consequence is that the gang geography of New York City gets replicated, condensed, and intensified inside the jail. For a new arrival, the map is invisible, but everyone else can read it. Movement across that invisible map without knowledge is how people get hurt. And getting hurt at Rikers is not a minor risk. According to data compiled by the New York City Independent Budget Office and cited in multiple legal filings, the rate of violent incidents at Rikers in recent years has been among the highest of any jail system in the United States, adjusted for population. The new arrival has choices, and none of them are simple. He can claim an affiliation he actually has, which immediately places him inside a protection structure, but also makes him a target for rival groups. He can deny any affiliation, which may protect him from one conflict, but leaves him exposed and unallied in a world where neutral ground barely exists. He can attempt to navigate quietly, keep his head down, stay invisible. Former detainees describe this third path as the hardest to maintain. Invisibility at Rikers, multiple accounts suggest, is something you have to actively perform, and performance requires information you don't have on day one. What the new arrival almost certainly doesn't know yet is that survival at Rikers rarely comes from strength alone. It comes from information, alliances, and a set of adaptive strategies that experienced detainees have developed over years. Some of them remarkably sophisticated, some of them heartbreaking in their simplicity. Those strategies are what this story is actually about. The first strategy is the oldest one in any confined and dangerous environment. Find someone who knows the rules before the rules find you. At Rikers, this person is almost always someone from your neighborhood. The borough network is the most immediate and reliable social structure available to a new arrival. Researchers studying New York City's incarcerated population have consistently found that neighborhood ties, hyperlocal street-level connections, function as the primary social scaffold inside Rikers, operating underneath and around formal gang hierarchies. The Bronx Defenders, a public defense organization that has interviewed hundreds of clients about their Rikers experiences, has documented how this works in practice. A new arrival from Fordham Road in the Bronx will, within hours, likely encounter someone who knows someone from that same stretch. That connection, however tenuous on the outside, becomes significant on the inside. It is a voucher. It says, this person is knowable. This person has a context. Context is currency at Rikers. Without it, you are unknown, and unknown at Rikers is dangerous in a specific documented way. The Rikers population includes people who have been inside for months and need to demonstrate power to maintain their position. An unknown, unconnected new arrival is a test case. What can be taken from this person? How will they respond? The answers to those questions are assessed quickly. The second strategy is information gathering conducted under the appearance of passivity. Multiple former detainees, in interviews published by outlets including the Marshall Project and New York Magazine's ongoing Rikers coverage, describe learning to listen before speaking, to watch foot traffic patterns in the housing unit, to note which bunks cluster together at meals, which groups control access to the phone, which officer is consistent and which is absent. This intelligence-gathering phase, informal, invisible, and constant, is how people begin to map the power structure of their specific housing unit. This isn't paranoia. It is rational adaptation to a genuinely dangerous environment. The New York City Board of Corrections monthly reports have documented hundreds of slashings and stabbings at Rikers in recent years. In 2021 and 2022 alone, as the city struggled with COVID-related staffing shortages and a surge in the jail population, violence metrics reached levels that prompted emergency federal oversight discussions. The physical danger is real, documented, and ongoing. Against that backdrop, the information-gathering behavior described by former detainees looks less like prison movie cliché and more like the kind of situational awareness that trauma specialists and conflict researchers recognize as an adaptive stress response. The third strategy involves the management of visible identity, a deliberate performance of belonging or neutrality. Former detainees who had no gang affiliation describe carefully studying and adopting the behavioral signals of the dominant group in their housing unit without ever formally claiming membership. The way you walk, where you sit, who you acknowledge and how, when you speak and when you don't. These micro-signals communicate alliance, neutrality, or challenge, and experienced detainees read them fluently. Researchers at John Jay College of Criminal Justice who study gang dynamics in New York City have documented this phenomenon, describing it as identity code switching under coercion. It is not the same as joining a gang, but it is a survival strategy that exists entirely because the formal system, the officers, the administration, the official classification system, has not provided a safer alternative. The fourth strategy, and perhaps the most psychologically costly, is debt management. At Rikers, informal economies are extensively documented. Commissary goods, Ramen noodles, chips, hygiene products function as currency. Debts accumulate, and debt, in a confined environment where enforcement is handled informally, is one of the most reliable catalysts for gang-related violence. Court records from assault cases originating at Rikers frequently trace the violence back to commissary debts, sometimes for amounts that would seem trivially small on the outside. $5, 2 bags of chips. But in a world where formal financial systems don't operate and physical consequences fill the enforcement gap, debt is not trivial. Former detainees described the strategy of refusing all credit as a primary protective behavior, going without rather than acquiring an obligation that could later be collected violently. Simple, brutal, entirely rational. The violence at Rikers does not always begin inside Rikers. This is one of the most important and consistently underreported dimensions of gang conflict in the jail, and it is extensively documented in court records, DOC incident reports, and investigative journalism by outlets, including ProPublica and the City NYC. When rival gang members from the same neighborhood, the same block in some documented cases, are both arrested and both sent to Rikers, they bring their conflict with them. The jail does not pause the war. It concentrates it. It removes the possibility of avoidance. On the outside, rivals can take different routes, avoid certain corners, stay in their territory. Inside a housing unit measuring roughly the size of a school gymnasium, that geographic separation disappears. The DOJ's 2021 findings specifically noted the failure of the city's jail system to adequately separate known rivals. Classification systems designed to prevent co-housing of enemies were documented as inconsistently applied, partly due to staffing shortages, partly due to administrative failures, partly because the intelligence about who is a rival to whom frequently doesn't transfer accurately from NYPD records to DOC classification systems. The result is what researchers and officers alike describe as a pressure cooker effect. Conflict that might have stayed dormant on the outside ignites inside, where the stakes are visible to everyone, where status and dominance are under constant negotiation, and where backing down has consequences that extend beyond the immediate situation. Former corrections officers who spoke to the Marshall Project described specific dynamics: a look held too long in the yard, a slight at the phone, a disputed bunk assignment. These triggers are understood within the jail culture as public tests. How a person responds, whether they respond, is watched and remembered. The response shapes their position in the housing unit's informal hierarchy for the duration of their stay. For people trying to stay out of this system entirely, the coping strategies become more complex and more costly. Some detainees, according to advocacy organization reports and court filings, request protective custody, formally asking to be isolated from the general population. This removes them from the immediate threat. But protective custody at Rikers has been extensively documented as deeply damaging. Conditions frequently involve 23-hour lockdown, limited access to programming, attorneys, or family visits. Mental health deteriorates, and there is a stigma within the incarcerated community. Requesting protective custody marks a person in ways that follow them if they return to general population. Some request housing transfers to different units, a process that is formally available but practically difficult, dependent on officer responsiveness and administrative processing speed. In a system as overwhelmed as Rikers has been in recent years, transfer requests have reportedly languished for weeks. Some detainees, particularly those with longer stays ahead of them, invest in building genuine relationships, not transactional alliances, but actual social connections with people who have no interest in the gang conflict. Older men, people focused on GED programs, people with court dates coming up who can't afford to catch a new charge. The Osborne Association, which provides reentry and in-jail programming at Rikers, has documented how access to structured programming, education classes, vocational training, mental health support, functions as a conflict reduction mechanism, not just because it keeps people occupied, but because it creates cross-cutting social ties that cut across gang affiliations. When you're sitting in a GED class with someone from a rival set and you've worked on the same math problem together for an hour, the social reality shifts, even incrementally. These spaces, educational, religious, programmatic, are described by multiple former detainees as the closest thing to neutral ground that actually functions inside Rikers. They are also, according to Board of Correction data and advocacy group reports, chronically underfunded and undersupported. The system that could most reduce gang conflict is the system receiving the least resources. The numbers behind the violence, the specific moments where the system broke down on record, and the voices of the people who came out the other side. If this is hitting different than you expected, hit subscribe and stay locked in. It gets more specific from here. In 2021, Rikers Island became international news, not for a single dramatic incident, but for the cumulative weight of a system in documented collapse. Deaths, escapes, staff no-shows leaving housing units functionally unmonitored for hours. Detainees managing their own units by default. The New York Times, the City NYC, and multiple advocacy organizations published investigation after investigation. Mayor Eric Adams faced calls from the UN Special Rapporteur on torture to close the facility. The federal monitor overseeing the jail under a long-standing consent decree, the Nunez Agreement, filed emergency reports describing conditions that violated basic constitutional standards. In that environment, gang conflict didn't just continue, it restructured. According to reporting by the City NYC, which has conducted some of the most detailed on-the-ground journalism about Rikers in recent years, the staffing crisis of 2021 to 2022 created power vacuums in housing units that organized groups, including gang-affiliated detainees, moved to fill. When officers were absent, someone still had to manage the unit. Disputes over bunks, phones, and commissaries still needed resolution. Informal leaders, sometimes gang-affiliated, sometimes simply older and more experienced detainees, stepped into that gap. This dynamic, incarcerated people managing incarcerated people in the absence of formal supervision, is extensively documented in correctional research. It is not unique to Rikers, but at Rikers in 2021, it operated at a scale and visibility that was exceptional. For individuals trying to survive that period, the coping strategies described in earlier chapters became simultaneously more necessary and more unreliable. The information networks that normally provided some warning of incoming conflict were disrupted by the chaos. Housing transfers were essentially frozen. Programming was suspended, and the protective custody option became, in some documented cases, physically dangerous in its own right, as oversight of those units also deteriorated. Former detainees who were at Rikers during this period and who have spoken to advocacy organizations describe a collapse of even the informal social structures that had previously provided some stability. When the gang hierarchy itself is uncertain, because leadership has shifted, because people have been transferred, because the system is too chaotic to maintain normal patterns, the information-based survival strategies break down. What emerged in testimony from that period is something researchers describe as hypervigilance at scale. An entire population on constant alert, sleeping lightly, eating quickly, never fully settling. The psychological cost of sustained threat anticipation is well documented in trauma literature. For people who entered Rikers already carrying trauma from street violence, poverty, and housing instability, the compounding effect was severe. Mental health crises at Rikers spiked alongside the violence metrics. According to data cited in legal filings by the Legal Aid Society, the jail's mental health population, already comprising a significant proportion of detainees, faced care delays and medication disruptions during the staffing crisis that exacerbated both individual crises and group-level volatility. The connection between mental health and gang conflict inside Rikers is more direct than it might appear. Untreated trauma, paranoia, impaired judgment, these don't just affect individuals. They affect the social environment of a housing unit. The person who misreads a neutral gesture as threatening and responds physically. The person who can't regulate their response to a minor conflict. The person who, in another context, would de-escalate, but in this one cannot. Multiple correction officers, in depositions and interviews, have described the experience of managing housing units with significant proportions of people in acute or unmanaged mental health crisis as unmanageable without dramatically increased clinical support. That support was not provided. The formal system's failure created the conditions that made gang-based informal structures more powerful and more dangerous. The people who have studied Rikers longest are not optimistic about quick fixes, but they're specific about what the evidence shows works. And that specificity matters, because the coping strategies that individual detainees develop under pressure, the information networks, the careful identity management, the debt avoidance, the alliance building through neutral spaces, are not the real solution. They are adaptation to a failed system. They deserve to be recognized as evidence of human resilience. But they should never be confused with adequate substitutes for the structural changes that would make them unnecessary. The violence interrupter model, which originated in Chicago through the work of epidemiologist Gary Slutkin and the organization now known as Cure Violence Global, has been piloted in New York City both on the streets and in partnership with correctional settings. The model trains people with firsthand experience of gang conflict, many of them formerly incarcerated, to identify and interrupt violence before it escalates. The documented outcomes in community settings have been significant enough that multiple cities have expanded the programs substantially. Applied inside a jail setting, the logic is the same. People with credibility inside gang-affiliated communities can mediate conflicts before they become physical, not because of official authority, but because of recognized status. The Osborne Association and other Rikers-connected organizations have advocated for this model's expansion inside the jail. The research on programming access is consistent across multiple studies. Incarcerated people who have access to education, vocational training, and mental health support have lower rates of in-facility violence. The mechanism is not mysterious. Meaningful activity reduces idle time during which conflict incubates. Cross-cutting social ties reduce the dominance of gang-based social structures. Mental health treatment reduces the acute psychiatric volatility that can trigger violence. The barrier is not knowledge. The barrier is resources and political will. New York City has been under federal oversight for its jail system since the Nunez Consent Decree in 2015. That decree resulted from class action litigation over systemic violence at Rikers, particularly violence against adolescents and young adults. A decade later, the federal monitor's reports still document persistent noncompliance in key areas. The question of whether Rikers should be closed entirely, replaced by smaller borough-based jails, has been the subject of intense political debate in New York City for years. The plan to build 4 new facilities and close Rikers, passed by the City Council in 2019, has faced cost overruns, construction delays, and political opposition. As of the most recent reporting, the timeline has shifted multiple times. In the meantime, thousands of people, most of them legally innocent, most of them poor, disproportionately Black and Latino, from communities already marked by decades of underinvestment, cycle through a system that requires them to develop sophisticated, psychologically costly survival strategies just to make it to their court date. The men who developed those strategies, the information networks, the neutral space navigation, the commissary debt avoidance, the identity code switching, did not develop them because they are exceptional. They developed them because the system left them no other choice. That is the most important thing this story can leave you with. Not the violence, not the gang hierarchies, not the chaos of 2021. The extraordinary, ordinary competence of human beings adapting to a system designed by funding choices, by policy choices, by decades of political neglect to break them. And the question that every documented account of Rikers raises and never fully answers: how many of the people who develop the skills to survive inside are using those same adaptive skills, the hypervigilance, the informal network building, the constant threat assessment, long after they leave? And at what cost? That question lives beyond Rikers. It lives in every neighborhood these men return to, and it is ultimately everyone's problem to answer. The system is documented. The failures are on record. The solutions are known. What happens next depends entirely on whether anyone is paying enough attention to demand them. If this story made you think differently about what justice actually means and what it costs the people caught inside it, share it with someone who needs to see it. And if you want to understand how another American institution processes human beings through a broken system, the next video is already waiting for you.